At 04:17 a.m. on December 14, 1944, Private First Class Raymond Ray Collier sat in the frozen ditch that bordered a narrow country road near Echternach, Luxembourg. His breath came in short, shallow bursts that misted the air before vanishing into the darkness. His fingers, wrapped in torn wool gloves, clutched the M1 Garand across his lap, the steel of its barrel cold enough to burn the skin if touched for too long. He hadn't slept for 38 hours. His eyes burned, his lips were cracked and bleeding, and every sound beyond the ruined tree line made his stomach twist. The Ardennes were dead quiet in that moment before dawn. Too quiet, as the veterans used to say. The quiet before the German guns woke up again. Ray was 21 years old, from a small lumber town in northern Maine, and he had already watched 6 of his closest friends die in ambushes along roads just like this one. What haunted him wasn't just their deaths. It was the way they died. Clean headshots, single cracks from unseen rifles that tore through their steel M1 helmets as though the helmets had been made of cardboard. The first time it happened, to Private Henry Ross, Ray had believed it was bad luck. The second time, to Corporal Dunn, he started to think the snipers were getting smarter. By the third and fourth, he realized it was something else entirely. The German marksmen weren't just shooting. They were aiming for the reflections on the helmets. Under winter sun, even the dull, olive-drab paint of an M1 could catch a glint of light, just enough to betray a position in the frost-whitened trees. He'd learned this the hard way. 2 nights before, when his squad had been ambushed outside Burdorf, Ray had watched the flash of a Mauser rifle 20 yards to his left. He turned just in time to see Private Lloyd Tanner's helmet pop back, a neat hole dead center in the forehead. Tanner was dead before he hit the ground. The sound that came from him wasn't even human, just a rush of air leaving lungs that didn't work anymore. Ray remembered the smell, wet iron and cordite mixed with the faint tang of pine sap. It was that smell that kept him awake at night. The next morning, when the medics cleared the bodies, Ray noticed something. Every single man killed by sniper fire had their helmets polished with the same light layer of oil that supply sergeants insisted on using to keep the steel from rusting. The oil darkened the surface and made it shine under certain angles. In the snow, that shine was death. He stared at the pile of helmets on the truck bed and felt something twist in his gut. When he told his platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Cole, a Kansas farm boy turned career soldier, that he wanted to dull down his helmet, Cole had laughed. "You can paint it pink for all I care, Collier. Just don't come crying when your brain freezes." The men around him chuckled. Helmets weren't something you messed with. Regulations were clear. Equipment had to be maintained to spec. Oil it, clean it, wear it. Period. But Ray didn't laugh. He waited until the squad moved out, then crouched behind a burned-out Kubelwagen and pulled off his helmet. He studied it in the faint light. The olive paint had worn off along the edges, and underneath, the raw metal gleamed like silver when it caught the moon. He could see his reflection in it. Hollow eyes, chapped lips, a young man who'd seen too much too soon. That was when he did something that every regulation manual would have called stupid. He dragged the edge of his bayonet across the surface of the helmet, scoring the paint into a rough crosshatch. Then he rubbed handfuls of wet dirt and charcoal from the vehicle's burned tires across it until the sheen was gone. The helmet looked terrible, uneven, dirty, matte. But when he lifted it to the sky, it reflected nothing. The first test came later that morning. His unit was moving down a tree-lined road toward Lauterborn when they took fire. The first bullet snapped overhead. The squad scattered, diving into ditches and snowbanks. Ray pressed his face into the frozen mud and waited. He heard the familiar whistle of a German Mauser round. The crack, the split-second whistle, the sound of steel on stone. Only this time, the bullet missed him. It missed by inches, striking the road behind his shoulder. He turned his head just enough to see where the sniper had been aiming, the spot his helmet used to glint. He realized the shot had gone high because there was no reflection to lock onto. For the next 20 minutes, they were pinned down. Every time someone tried to peek out, another shot came. Sergeant Cole's helmet took a hit that dented the steel like a fist. He cursed and ducked back. "They got the range," he yelled. But Ray knew it wasn't just range, it was visibility. The helmets were giving them away. So he did something reckless. He crawled through the ditch under fire, reached Cole's position, and smeared a handful of blackened mud over the sergeant's helmet without asking permission. Cole started to yell, then froze when he saw Ray's eyes. The next time Cole rose to shoot, The sniper missed him too. When the firefight ended, they'd lost 2 men, but the survivors started whispering. They'd seen what Ray did. They saw that it worked. That night, around a small fire hidden under a tarp, they passed helmets around, scratching them, darkening them, coating them with soot from burned ration tins. The air was filled with the scraping of bayonets and the smell of scorched metal. One by one, the polished helmets disappeared into the darkness, replaced by rough, dull shapes that blended with the forest. Word spread fast. Within 3 days, half the platoon had Collier helmets. Within a week, the entire company did. Officers complained, quartermasters fumed, but the casualty numbers didn't lie. Ambush survival rates in their unit improved dramatically. In one report, a lieutenant noted that visibility from sniper positions against E Company elements is significantly reduced. No one mentioned Ray by name, just field modification, possibly unauthorized. The Germans noticed too. Snipers reported difficulty distinguishing heads from background. One after-action diary recovered later described American helmets now matte black, impossible to detect under tree cover. It wasn't perfect. They still took losses, still froze and bled like everyone else. But the change saved lives. Ray never bragged. When officers asked, he shrugged and said he was just tired of shining targets. He never wrote about it in his letters home. He didn't think it mattered. But to the men who survived, it did. When the 4th Infantry pushed into Germany in early 1945, Collier's trick had become standard practice in his regiment. Some units started officially issuing mud-blackened helmets. The Army later adopted textured paint and rough finishes as part of the next design iteration. By war's end, Ray had 2 Purple Hearts and a reputation for being that crazy kid who dirtied his gear. But the story faded. Regulations changed, new wars began, and the dull finish helmet became standard everywhere. Nobody remembered who started it. Years later, in 1972, an old helmet surfaced at a veterans auction in Maine. It was scratched, blackened, the inside liner marked PFC R. Collier, 4th INF Dev. The auctioneer thought it was worth maybe $20. He didn't know that in a way, that stupid helmet trick had saved hundreds of men from sniper fire in the Ardennes, not because it was clever, but because one soldier refused to trust the rules more than his instincts. The helmet now sits in a private collection, unpolished, still bearing the faint marks of that cold December morning. Scratches, soot, and the memory of a frozen ditch where a young man from Maine decided that survival sometimes meant breaking orders to do what made sense. And though his name never appeared in any manual, every soldier who's ever dulled their gear before going into the field has, unknowingly, carried a piece of his defiance. In the weeks that followed the breakthrough at Echternach, Ray Collier's squad moved deeper into the Siegfried Line. It was January 1945 now, and the air itself seemed to cut like glass. The snow had crusted over with ice so hard you could hear boots crunching from 200 yards away. Their M1s rattled with frost, bolts sluggish with cold grease, and every breath left a pale ghost in the dim gray dawn. Ray's mud helmets were now standard among his company, though nobody had the nerve to put his name on the paperwork. Official reports called it a field adaptation for optical camouflage, a sterile phrase for something born out of desperation and blood. On January 6th, near a town called Hürtgen, the platoon was sent to clear a patch of pine forest that intelligence claimed was lightly held. They were wrong. It was a sniper's killing field. German paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, had dug into the ridgeline with MG-42s and scoped Mausers. The first man to fall was Corporal Rees. A single shot, silent but precise, hit him through the temple as he stepped over a log. The second was Private Simons, who had his pack blown apart by a burst of 7.19 mm rounds. The air turned into a blizzard of splinters, bark, and lead. Ray dove behind a rotted tree stump, bullets snapping over his head. He could hear Sergeant Cole shouting orders, his voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. "Find those damn shooters!" But the enemy was invisible. The sound of the rifles echoed off the trees in a dozen directions. The platoon was pinned, and panic began to spread. Men froze, unsure where to move. The ones who tried to look for muzzle flashes were hit within seconds. The rule was simple. In daylight, motion was death. Ray flattened himself in the snow, thinking fast. He spotted something, a pattern in the shots. The Germans weren't firing randomly. They were picking heads, one by one, looking for glints, motion, shape. And that's when it struck him again. Even dulled helmets could still stand out against white snow. The matte finish helped in forest shadow, but here, against open light, the contrast made them targets. The human brain was wired to see dark shapes on pale backgrounds. He needed the opposite, to make himself part of the snow. He pulled off his helmet, scooped a handful of snow, and smeared it across the steel until it caked white, mixing with the soot and dirt underneath. It stuck unevenly, freezing almost instantly. When he pressed it back onto his head, it burned his scalp with cold. But when he lifted it slightly, the reflection was gone, replaced by the dull frost that mirrored the ground around him. He crawled forward, slowly, one elbow at a time, and peeked over the stump. The next bullet went wide, not just a miss, but several feet off. The sniper's rhythm broke. Ray saw the glint of a scope deep among the trees. Just a flash, but enough. He raised his rifle, exhaled slowly, and fired. The shot cracked, echoed, and then there was silence. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then someone shouted in German, distant and angry. He'd hit him, maybe not killed, but hit. Cole saw it too. "Collier, what the hell did you just do?" "Snow," Ray gasped, still catching his breath. "They can't see me. Blend in." "Blend in?" Cole looked at him as though he'd gone mad. But then, under fire, logic bent to survival. He grabbed a handful of snow himself and slapped it on his helmet. "All right, you heard him. Everyone snow up." Within minutes, the whole platoon was covered in frost. Helmets, shoulders, even rifle stocks. They became pale ghosts crawling through the frozen undergrowth. The next time the snipers fired, their shots went high, wild, uncertain. The Americans closed the distance and returned fire with machine guns and grenades. When it was over, the forest was silent again, except for the soft ticking of cooling metal. They'd lost 3 men, but they'd taken the ridge. It wasn't until after the fight that Sergeant Cole really saw what Ray had done. The helmet was a frozen crust of soot and snow, uneven, ugly, but brilliant. "You know, kid," he said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands, "you keep doing this, they're gonna start calling you the snowman instead of the fool with the dirty helmet." Ray just shrugged, too numb to answer. By now, his improvisations had become whispers in the battalion. Field reports began using coded phrases like improved low-glare finish or environmental blending. Other platoons began copying it, first as jokes, then as habit. The higher-ups noticed the casualty charts shifting, marginally, but enough to raise eyebrows. They sent observers. A logistics captain arrived one afternoon, clipboard in hand, and asked to see Collier's equipment. Ray handed him the filthy helmet. The officer looked at it with disgust. "This is a violation of maintenance protocol." Ray stared back. "It's also the reason I'm still breathing." The captain didn't write that down. Regulations didn't bend easily, but the frontline troops did. The men of the 4th Infantry Division began altering their helmets not just with mud or snow, but with whatever their terrain offered. Moss in the woods, sand in the dunes, chalk dust in ruined towns. They joked that they were painting with survival. The Germans started calling them Schattenköpfe, shadowheads. It was a compliment of sorts, the enemy acknowledging what command would not. As winter turned to thaw and the push into Germany accelerated, Ray's trick evolved further. In early March, outside of Bitburg, he found himself leading a small patrol through the foggy remains of a bombed-out village. The air stank of sulfur and wet stone. They were searching for hidden machine gun nests when a burst of MG-42 fire shredded a nearby wall. The squad hit the dirt. Bullets chipped brick and ricocheted with metallic screams. Visibility was only 30 feet in the smoke. Ray could feel the vibration of each burst through the ground. He looked at his men, terrified, exhausted, their helmets gray with soot. Then he noticed something strange. The German gunners were firing slightly high over their heads. The fog was scattering the light, hiding them better than any paint job ever could. That was when he realized the deeper truth. Survival wasn't just about the helmet. It was about light, environment, instinct. The helmet trick had been just the beginning. That night, huddled in a ruined church, Ray began to sketch with a pencil stub on the inside of an ammo box lid. He drew shapes, light angles, positions of the sun, how shadow moved over snow or rubble at different hours. It wasn't art. It was science born of fear. He tested ideas in every fight that followed, dulling the rifle's barrel with ash, wrapping burlap around grenades to muffle their clink, rubbing candle soot over the edge of binocular lenses to prevent glare. Each detail shaved seconds off the enemy's advantage. By April, the tactics had spread beyond his unit. A lieutenant in another regiment reported men adapting personal camouflage techniques based on environmental reflection. The army never knew the name of the private who'd started it, but the numbers spoke for themselves. Sniper kills dropped significantly across sectors using those unofficial modifications. When the war finally ended, Ray returned to Maine with the same battered helmet, still streaked with dried mud and faint scratches from shrapnel. He worked as a millwright, married a nurse from Portland, and had 2 sons. He never told them much about what he did. To him, the war was something you survived, not something you glorified. But every winter, when snow covered the pine forest behind his house, he would go outside, look at the white silence, and remember that morning when instinct, fear, and defiance had given him one more day of life. Yet his story didn't vanish completely. In the 1950s, when the U.S. Army tested new helmet designs for Korea, one of the engineers noted in a report, "Field data from ETO suggest matte surfaces reduce sniper efficiency." No citation, no name, but the line was there. A ghost in the bureaucratic machine. The principle became doctrine. All combat helmets henceforth would use non-reflective coatings. Somewhere beneath that technical language lived Ray's legacy. He'd never see it, never know that soldiers decades later, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, would dull their helmets with dust, paint, and tape, for the same reason he'd smeared mud in 1944, to stay alive when the rules said otherwise. And on the inside rim of that old steel pot, faint but still legible, the engraving remains: R. Collier, Maine, 1944. A man who, in the worst winter of war, proved that sometimes the difference between dying by the book and living by instinct was the courage to do something that everyone else thought was stupid. In the summer of 1945, long after the German surrender, the 4th Infantry Division was stationed outside of Frankfurt, tasked with securing supply routes and overseeing the return of civilians. The fields that had once been torn by artillery were turning green again, dotted with red poppies that grew among the rusting hulks of tanks. The smell of war was still there, oil, ash, and the faint rot of things that hadn't yet been buried. But life was creeping back. For Ray Collier, that summer was strange. The gunfire had stopped, but silence had become its own kind of noise. He kept the helmet close, the same one that had kept him alive through the Ardennes, Hurtgen, and Bitburg. It hung from his pack like a charm against the world that had tried to erase him. He didn't talk about the war with the other men. They were already dreaming of ships home, of wives, of normalcy. But one afternoon, while they sat near the ruins of a burned farmhouse, Sergeant Cole brought it up. "You know, Collier," he said, squinting through the smoke of his cigarette, "someone's gonna write all this down one day, how a kid from Maine figured out what half the brass never did." Ray just smiled, hollow-eyed, tired beyond measure. "Doesn't matter who figured it out," he said quietly. "Just matters that it worked." But it did matter, at least to Cole. After the war, Cole stayed in the Army, rose through the ranks, and never forgot the lesson. He wrote reports on field adaptability, citing the importance of ground-born ingenuity in saving lives. His words would ripple through the training manuals of the next generation. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, American soldiers arrived wearing M1 helmets with a new finish. Matte, textured, glare-resistant, the same dirty surface Ray had once been mocked for. The improvement was hailed as an engineering evolution, not a grunt's idea. But among the veterans of the 4th Infantry, there was no mystery. They knew exactly where it came from. Ray himself didn't know. He had gone home to Maine and slipped back into quiet. He found work at the lumber mill, hands steady on the machines that sliced timber into neat lengths. The smell of pine sap and sawdust replaced that of gunpowder and blood. At night, he'd walk along the frozen riverbank with his wife Marianne and listen to the crack of the ice shifting in the current. Sometimes, when headlights caught his face at a certain angle, she'd see him flinch, an instinct honed by too many months under fire. He wasn't broken, but something in him remained tuned to danger. Every so often, the past reached for him. The sound of a dropped metal bucket, the pop of a truck's exhaust. Each one carried echoes of rifles, shells, and the whistle of near misses. Yet through it all, he kept his helmet. It sat on a shelf in the shed, dull and blackened, never cleaned. His sons would ask why he didn't polish it like the ones in the pictures, and he'd just say, "Because this is how it kept me alive." They didn't understand then, but they remembered it. In 1963, Ray was invited to a reunion in Washington. The 4th Infantry Division Association was gathering veterans from the Ardennes campaign. He went reluctantly, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, carrying his helmet in a brown paper bag. When he arrived, he found men older, heavier, some missing limbs, all bound by memory. They laughed too loud and drank too fast, filling the room with stories that began in horror and ended in disbelief that they'd survived. When Cole spotted him across the hall, he broke into a grin. "There he is," he shouted. "The mud helmet hero himself." The men around them cheered. Ray blushed, embarrassed. "That old story again?" he said. It wasn't heroics, it was just not wanting to die. But they knew better. In their minds, his defiance had become legend, the small, quiet act that turned chaos into a fighting chance. Decades later, in 1988, Ray passed away in his sleep, age 65. The newspaper obituary said little about his war, just served honorably in Europe, 1944-45. But among the items listed for his estate sale was one curious entry. One military helmet, painted black, surface heavily worn. It caught the attention of a collector who understood its significance, and so the helmet changed hands, ending up preserved in glass, its surface untouched. Today, when historians examine the evolution of soldier protection, they trace the lineage of modern combat helmets back to those years, the changes in coating, texture, and camouflage philosophy. But none of the official documents name the origin. It remains an unnamed field solution, an anonymous act of survival that quietly became standard doctrine. Yet if you hold an M1 or an ACH under the right light, you'll notice how it refuses to shine. The matte surface swallows the sun instead of reflecting it, and somewhere in that silence, the spirit of one exhausted young man in a frozen ditch still endures. The world forgot his name, but not his instinct. And that, perhaps, is the truest kind of immortality, not in medals or records, but in every soldier who lives because someone, once, dared to be stupid enough to think differently. When the decades rolled on and the world drifted farther from the smell of cordite and the silence of the Ardennes, the lessons that had been written not on paper but on men's skin began to fade from memory. By the 1990s, the soldiers who had fought through the frozen forests were few and gray, and their stories were filed away between yellowed pages and forgotten boxes of photographs. But every so often, something tangible re-emerged, a relic that spoke louder than words. In 1993, during a small military memorabilia exhibition in Portland, Maine, a man named Thomas Everett, himself a Gulf War veteran, stopped before a display case that held an oddly darkened M1 helmet. The tag read simply, "European Theater, 1944, 4th Infantry Division, provenance unknown." He leaned closer, studying the scratches that crossed its crown like veins, and then he noticed the faint engraving on the inside rim, R. Collier. The name meant nothing to the curator, but Everett had spent years studying battlefield adaptations, the little field-borne innovations that changed doctrine. He knew that the switch from polished to matte finish had happened almost overnight in late '44, precisely when the Battle of the Bulge was raging. He requested to examine the helmet up close, and when he lifted it, he could still smell the faint ghost of oil and dirt embedded deep in the steel. The pattern of soot and grime wasn't random. It bore the fingerprint of a man who had handled survival like an artist handles paint. Everett began digging through archives, veterans' rosters, and oral histories, trying to trace the name. It took him 2 years to find it. A declassified after-action report from January 1945 contained a marginal note, written in pencil, beside a description of improvised anti-reflective helmet finish. The note read, "Idea observed from Pit Collier, Maine." No first name, no commendation, but it was enough. Everett published an article in the Journal of Military Innovation titled "The Invisible Man, the Forgotten Field Modification That Saved Hundreds in the Ardennes." The piece never reached mainstream attention, but among military historians, it sparked quiet awe. For the first time, the story of a nameless soldier's defiance had a name again. In 1996, Everett visited Ray Collier's hometown. The lumber mill was gone, the river quieter than before. He found Marianne, now elderly but sharp-eyed, living in the small white house where Ray had spent his final years. When Everett introduced himself and explained why he was there, she invited him in and sat him down beside the wood stove. On the mantel stood a framed black and white photograph. A young man in uniform, smiling faintly, helmet tilted forward. "That's him," she said softly. He never talked about it, but every winter when the snow fell, he'd go out back and just stand there. Said the snow was honest, it didn't pretend. Everett asked if she had anything of his from the war. She disappeared into the attic and returned with a box marked "Property of U.S. Army." Inside were faded letters, a bent dog tag, and a single page from a field notebook, edges burned. Written in pencil, in neat but hurried handwriting, were these words: "Don't shine what the world can see. Shine what keeps you alive." It wasn't a poem. It wasn't philosophy. It was a creed born from a ditch outside Echternach. Everett wept quietly when he read it. 2 years later, he used his connections to petition the U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum to recognize Collier's contribution to field camouflage doctrine. It took a decade of correspondence, evidence gathering, and bureaucratic delays. But finally, in 2007, the museum added a small brass plaque beneath the display of the standard M1 helmet, reading, "In honor of PFC." Raymond Collier, 4th Infantry Division, whose instinct in the Ardennes inspired the adoption of the non-reflective helmet finish used by U.S. soldiers to this day. The plaque is small, easy to miss among the larger displays of tanks and rifles and medals. But for those who stop to read it, the story lingers. In the hum of the air-conditioned hall, you can almost hear the echo of wind over frozen trees, the crack of distant rifles, the breath of a young man who refused to polish his death. Meanwhile, in military academies around the world, instructors began teaching Collier's principle, not as a footnote to history, but as an example of adaptive thinking. The lesson was simple. In combat, survival often comes from those willing to question orders for the sake of reason. In simulation drills, when recruits hesitate to adjust their equipment for fear of violating protocol, instructors remind them, there's regulation and then there's reality. Collier knew the difference. In Afghanistan in 2012, a young infantryman named Specialist Rivera found himself pinned by sniper fire near a dry riverbed outside Sangin. His helmet, a modern Kevlar ACH with textured matte coating, bore a strip of reflective tape issued for identification. But under the merciless Afghan sun, the strip gleamed like a signal mirror. Rivera tore it off, rubbed a handful of dust across the surface, and thought, better dirty than dead. He survived that day. When he got back to base, an older sergeant grinned and said, "Smart, old trick, goes all the way back to some crazy kid in World War II." Rivera didn't know the name, but he smiled anyway. That's how legacies live, not in statues or headlines, but in habits passed down like whispers. Each generation of soldiers carries fragments of the last. The way they move through shadow, the way they silence metal, the way they learn that sometimes breaking a small rule keeps the bigger one, staying alive. And so the story circles back, from the snowfields of Luxembourg to the deserts of Helmand, from a frozen helmet streaked with soot to polymer shells dusted with Afghan sand. The technology has changed, but the instinct remains the same. The quiet defiance that refuses to die. If you ever visit that museum in Virginia and stand before the case of helmets, you'll see them lined from oldest to newest, steel to Kevlar to composite, each duller, quieter, more ghost-like. And if you look closely at the very first one, the scratched, soot-darkened relic from the winter of 1944, you might imagine the man who once crouched beneath it. 21 years old, cold, terrified, deciding in the stillness between gunshots that survival was worth disobedience. His name was Raymond Collier. He never sought recognition, never asked for forgiveness, and never believed what he did was remarkable. But the world he left behind, every soldier who now steps into battle with a helmet that does not shine, carries his mark, invisible yet indelible. Sometimes history doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through steel and silence, through the texture of paint and the ghost of a man who once chose to make himself invisible, and by doing so, ensured that countless others would be seen again at the dawn.